I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Say it out loud. It sounds ancient, biblical almost, like something carved into stone. It is not ancient. The man who said it was born in 1904, wore a fedora, and had, by most accounts, a terrible poker face. He didn't say it in the desert in 1945. He said it 30 years later, in a television studio, sitting under studio lights, being asked to remember. J. Robert Oppenheimer was not supposed to be a soldier of any kind. He was a physicist, trained at Harvard and Göttingen, fluent in Sanskrit as a hobby. The kind of man who read the Bhagavad Gita for pleasure the way other people read detective novels. Colleagues described him as brilliant and brittle in equal measure, capable of finishing another scientist's sentence and capable of humiliating them for it in the same breath. By 1942, he was 38 years old, still relatively unproven as an administrator, and had never managed so much as a large lab. Then the U.S. Army handed him something almost nobody expected him to get: command of the Manhattan Project's weapons laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. He would spend the next 3 years turning theoretical physics into the deadliest object ever built by human hands. He got the job partly because he understood the physics better than almost anyone alive. He kept the job because he turned out to be startlingly good at holding together a town full of feuding geniuses, egos, and secrets. Nobody, including Oppenheimer, was entirely sure what kind of man would come out the other side. Picture the New Mexico desert before dawn on July 16, 1945. It's cold, genuinely cold. The kind of high desert chill that surprises people who only think of New Mexico as sun and sand. Scientists are lying flat on the ground miles from a 100-foot steel tower, wearing welder's goggles, coated in sunscreen against a light that hasn't happened yet. For 3 years, this moment has been the only moment that mattered. Oppenheimer has lost weight he didn't have to lose. He smokes constantly, eats almost nothing, and by his own admission is running on nerves and black coffee. His brother Frank, standing near him that morning, will later say, Oppenheimer looked like a man walking to his own execution. Not because he feared dying, but because he wasn't sure what he was about to become. Nobody in that desert knows, with certainty, what will happen when the countdown hits 0. There's a real documented fear, voiced seriously by physicist Edward Teller months earlier, that the explosion could ignite the atmosphere itself and burn the planet's air like paper. The calculations say no. The calculations have been wrong before. The countdown reaches 0. And then there is light. Not an explosion first, but light. A light so total that a blind woman more than 100 miles away reportedly perceives it. Then the heat arrives, then the shockwave, then a fireball climbing into a mushroom cloud that a physicist named Isidore Rabi later says felt like something with its own intention, its own will to exist. Oppenheimer's actual first words, recorded by witnesses standing right next to him, are almost aggressively ordinary. It worked. That's it. Just a low, tired confirmation from a man who has spent 3 years unsure it would. There is no Sanskrit. There is no destroyer of worlds. Not yet. The Gita line comes later, yeah, but it isn't invented later. It comes from somewhere real in Oppenheimer's mind, and to understand it, you have to understand the actual passage he was quoting. In the Bhagavad Gita, the god Vishnu takes the form of the deity Krishna and reveals his cosmic, terrifying, true form to the warrior prince Arjuna, who is paralyzed with doubt on a battlefield, unsure whether he has the right to kill even in a just cause. Krishna's answer isn't kill without guilt. It's closer to death and destruction are inevitable, and vast, larger than any one person's choice, and your duty is to act rightly within a role you did not fully choose and cannot fully escape. That is the philosophical knife Oppenheimer is actually reaching for. Not glory, not power, a specific ancient text about a man forced into a role of violence he didn't want, wrestling with whether doing his duty makes him guilty of what follows. Oppenheimer had read the Gita in the original Sanskrit years before Los Alamos, under a Berkeley professor who taught him the language partly for fun. So when he later described what went through his mind at Trinity, he wasn't performing erudition. He was reaching, honestly, for the only language he had that felt adequate to the size of what he'd just watched happen. An event that plain English words like big or powerful simply couldn't hold. Not everyone believes the Gita line, exactly as told, was really running through his head in real time on July 16th. Some historians point out that Oppenheimer was, by nature, a myth-maker about himself. A man who curated his own legend carefully in interviews, letters, and public appearances for the rest of his life. Physicist and Los Alamos colleague William Deke Parsons remembered the actual mood in the bunker differently. Tense silence, scattered nervous laughter, someone shouting, "It works," and a fierce sense of relief mixed with dread. Nobody at the time reported Oppenheimer murmuring Sanskrit scripture into the desert air. There's a more uncomfortable possibility worth sitting with, that Oppenheimer needed later to have felt something appropriately profound in that moment, and the Gita line let him claim retroactively that he did. Whether it's a precise memory or an act of self-mythology doesn't make it meaningless. It might make it more human. A man trying years afterward to explain a feeling he didn't have the vocabulary for at the time, and reaching for the most serious language he owned. Either way, both readings agree on one thing. Whatever he felt standing in that desert, it wasn't triumph. Here's where the quote gets hijacked. Pop culture has turned, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds," into a swagger line. Something you'd expect from a supervillain right before a monologue, not a man privately horrified by what he'd helped create. Christopher Nolan's 2023 film Oppenheimer actually restores real context, placing the line where it belongs, in a quiet, haunted register, not a triumphant one. But plenty of the internet reaction around the film stripped it right back out, turning the line into memes, workout captions, and villain-era social posts, completely inverted from what Oppenheimer meant by it. Then there's the pure misquote problem. People often render it as, "Now I am become death," or "I have become death," small variations that shift the grammar and, with it, the feel. The actual translation Oppenheimer used carries an odd, formal, almost biblical construction, "I am become," that modern paraphrases smooth away, losing the weight it was built to carry. And perhaps the strangest twist of all, Oppenheimer never said this line in the moment he's most associated with. He said it in a 1965 NBC television interview, 20 years after Trinity, sitting still, choosing his words with visible difficulty, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. The documentary segment is famous. What actually happened in the desert wasn't. The weight of that morning didn't stay confined to a quote he gave decades later. Oppenheimer spent the rest of his life publicly wrestling with what he'd built. Months after Trinity meeting President Truman in the Oval Office, he reportedly told him, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, unmoved and irritated, later called him a crybaby scientist and reportedly told aides never to bring that man back into his office. Oppenheimer's guilt didn't earn him sympathy from the government he'd served. In 1954, during the paranoid climate of the Red Scare, his security clearance was stripped in a humiliating closed-door hearing that dug through his past left-wing associations and effectively ended his role in shaping nuclear policy. The man who built the bomb was formally declared, by his own country, not trustworthy enough to keep discussing it. He spent his remaining years as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, publicly respected, privately sidelined, occasionally granting interviews where reporters kept steering him back to the same desert morning, the same quote, the same terrible dawn, as if that were the only thing about him anyone wanted to understand. He died in 1967. Nearly 6 decades after Trinity in 2022, the U.S. government formally vacated the 1954 decision that stripped his clearance, acknowledging what many historians had argued for years. The process against him had been unfair. We keep reaching for that line because we still don't have better language for what it describes. The moment a person realizes they've built something bigger than their own ability to control it. Oppenheimer wasn't quoting scripture to sound powerful. He was quoting it because English failed him, and an ancient text about duty, violence, and consequence was the only thing large enough to hold what he'd done. Every time we build something we can't take back, and we keep building those things, we inherit his exact problem. It worked, and now what?